Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in the clown decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And if you want to keep up with all things clown decade, please do subscribe to the channel and of course become a channel member. Right, today we are going through the fallout of Robert Jenrick's kicking out of the Tory party and subsequent joining of the Reform Party. I went through my basic initial thoughts through that last Friday because I kind of had to, given I am still suspicious of him, but I do have to say, so far, he has been a net benefit for joining Reform. If nothing else, it is because of the clear cope and seethe coming out of the Tory party, with many people saying, well, we don't want this loyalty here, despite the fact that basically the Tory party is known for regicide at this point. Prime example here, Tories are getting their act together after Robert Jenrick defection, says Kemi Badenoch. The Tory leader thanks Nigel Farage for doing the spring cleaning for her, which from what I've seen from Twitter, especially from Robert Jenrick fans, because ultimately they have taken this as a clear signal that, oh, I guess we are the garbage that need to be ridded from the Tory party. Thankfully we have an alternative natural home. Of course, if they end up winning over the Tory party, the Wets would have a natural home in the Lib Dems, which really does come down to what is the point of the Tory party. And I'll just give you a spoiler. Social club. That's basically the only reason people are still in there at this point. You look on Twitter and all the people defending it, there's plenty of pictures of them hanging out and dancing with plenty of Tory MPs, staffers and all that. Most people are there because it is a social affair, not for the good of the country. So Kemi Badenoch claims that Farage was taking away her problems, which I suppose there would be, given he was basically the only serious challenger from an alternative faction within your party, though I'm not going to lie, I still see James Cleverly leading the Tories into the next election, though to be fair, I think the chances of that have substantially dropped, because I think the Tory party are mad enough to put the blinders on to the point of saying, how can Kemi possibly lose? When really the question for the rest of the country is, who's Kemi Badenoch? She told GB News that the Tory party is even more united and stronger because we've lost someone who is not a team player. Again, from the things that I've been seeing on Twitter, I think Reform are going to end up with about 5,000 more members at this point. Bear in mind, at the last Tory leadership election, it was fairly close, but over 20,000 people voted for Robert Jenrick. You can't pretend that this is some rogue within your party. He represents a massive part of it. And trying to be pig-headed like this probably isn't the best way forward, but ultimately it's been pointed out elsewhere. Growing up in Nigeria probably nurtures you to have this pig-headed approach to, if you're not loyal to me, then you're nothing. Which I don't think Kemi Badenoch would particularly find offensive. Ultimately, your upbringing does affect your personality. Jenrick, who had challenged Badenoch for the leadership party in 2024, confirmed on Thursday he was first having conversations with Reform in September, which, by the way, the timeline for that indicates that Danny Kruger moved to Reform, and Jenrick pretty much instantly thought, maybe I should follow him. These conversations were being fed back to Badenoch by a mole in Jenrick's team, so he wasn't just leaving pieces of paper around with his evil plan to defect. He had a mole in his team, which, to be honest with you, I wouldn't be shocked if Reform have given him a mole too. Badenoch continued saying that Conservatives who were not loyal should follow Jenrick out of the door. I probably would not say that if I was Tory leader at the moment, especially if I'm trying to call the One Nation side, but there we go. If they're people who do not belong in our party, who think that it's all a game and that people's lives are a game, they should want all this psychodrama, they should go. I'm not being funny, but at the time of empires in the 1800s, it was literally called the Great Game. Politics is kind of a game, and part of that game is choosing which team you are going to be representing, and obviously Jenrick has been pushed into representing the Teal team, who, by the way, are still top in the polls, as much as Tories would like to pretend there's about 2-point difference between us. People can see that the Tory party is getting its act together. We're a changed party under new leadership, and the people who can't deal with that are leaving. Badenoch also accused former Shadow Justice Secretary of telling a lot of lies, adding that you can't believe a word that comes out of his mouth. Again, everything's going fine, I'm sure. Despite the fact that, again, there's thousands of people who have joined Reform since last Thursday. I went along leafleting this weekend, and basically every boomer there was really happy about Jenrick defecting and are looking forward to Suella Braverman's, which, looking back on all my videos, I'm thinking, I'd be a little more concerned about that. But at the end of the day, if this is damaging the Tory party, it is a net positive, because Tories do lend a rest. Anyway, the Financial Times did obviously offer some balance, saying that former Tory Cabinet Minister Lord David Frost said that the Tories and Reform are now engaged in a street fight to the death. Each party is trying to kill off the other and has no alternative to doing so. Politicians who try and build bridges are likely to find it career-ending, he wrote in the Telegraph. Which is what Jacob Rees-Mogg is still trying to do, and everyone in his comments is saying, no, Tories must die. But if you're ever going to have an archetypical Tory, it's going to be Jacob Rees-Mogg, so obviously he doesn't want that to die. One former MP said Farage was in danger of raising expectations too high by suggesting that a well-known Labour figure would defect to Reform next week. It's apparently an ex-MP, and, well, even if it's not a well-known Labour figure, the whole point is to put a lid on the Tory 2.0 accusation. That's the point. So I'm happy for them to go ahead with it. Anyway, it's clear that the Tory line on all this is that Robert Jenrick was actually of no use to the Tory party whatsoever, and he can do one. Again, the problem you have with the Tory party is that, it is a broad church, or was anyway, and now Reform's being one, so we're definitely going to run into these problems. But because it's a broad church, it's made up of many factions, and basically the one that's been in charge, well, since Cameron really, the neo-Blairites, they are basically saying you have to be a neo-Blairite, otherwise you weren't ever really part of the team and a totally useless moron. I mean, just take a look at what Kevin Hollinrake, the chairman of the Tory party, says here.
Kevin Hollinrake, are you sad to see Robert Jenrick go?
Well, of course you don't want to see a colleague leave your party, of course not. But Kemi's doing absolutely the right thing. You can't have disloyal people in your party.
And Kemi Badenoch, what do you think of that today? I mean, it was pretty strong stuff, wasn't it?
That's exactly who Kemi is. A very strong person, knows her own mind, calm under pressure, and that's what she's demonstrated today. The evidence is clear and compelling, and she's done the right thing.
Just total and complete Kemi did everything correctly, which, whether they believe it or not, this is what you are going to be hearing from an awful lot of either fully blown Tories or even One Nation sympathetic people. I mean, the Times comments have been absolutely crazy about the Jenrick defection, basically saying, oh, this is making me want to vote Tory again, which you probably will do. But ultimately, why are they voting Tory? Because Lib Dems are a joke. Honestly, I'm not going to go on too much of a tangent, but Lib Dem MPs are getting fed up of Ed Davey basically being nothing more than a laughingstock with all his hobby horsing. They're not being treated seriously, and nobody really knows what they stand for beyond Donald Trump bad. I can't believe I didn't do the meme. Orange man bad and Farage man bad, and that's all they really have to say. And Lib Dems are getting fed up with it. I think they took... There was a Telegraph article basically asking what's the point of the Lib Dems, and I think they really took it to heart. They even had a debate on The Spectator about it. But basically, I think a lot of the MPs in the Lib Dems are very annoyed that Tories are basically stealing their thunder. Basically, the Tory party can survive because the Lib Dems have become an absolute joke, because they've not actually had to do anything for about a decade and a half. Anyway, one of the main points of contention that Jenrick apparently had with Kemi Badenoch and the rest of, well, half, I should say, of the shadow cabinet, which makes up the bulk of the Tory party in Parliament, by the way, is over the use of the language broken Britain. So Tory party leader Kemi Badenoch has insisted Britain is not broken after her former shadow minister Robert Jenrick criticised her party for failing to campaign on that line, which they should have. One thing that a lot of people are fed up with the Tory party with is the fact that they basically have set Britain on fire and pretending this is fine. No, sorry, you need to be basically grovelling for votes back as far as I'm concerned. This is why... God, they're second now, but they were fourth in some polls a couple of months ago. Close to 4 months ago. And really, the only reason they've come back is because Labour have come in and thrown a Molotov cocktail into the House of Britain on top of the gas fire that they already started. She wrote in the Daily Telegraph, ours is still one of the most successful, resilient and influential countries on earth. I suppose that's why Donald Trump's just tariffed us along with the rest of Europe, adding that telling voters their country is finished only drags them down. Sorry, there's a difference between saying Britain is broken and fixable and the country is finished, move away. Robert Jenrick is not Peter Hitchens. She also insisted that the Tories were stronger after she sacked Jenrick's arrows before he defected to Reform. Okay, Jenrick told the BBC's Laura Kusenberg in an interview on Friday that a shadow cabinet meeting in which colleagues had failed to agree that the country was broken had been the final straw for him. And basically that's when he decided he was going to be defecting, and then obviously the mole told Kemi Badenoch. In her editorial, Kemi Badenoch said that there were problems in the UK, some of which were getting worse, but that the country's best days laid ahead. In other words, Britain is broken and it's fixable, which is all that Robert Jenrick's saying. What this comes down to is that it is semantics being used by the Reform Party. That is the problem. You are basically saying, if we campaign on Britain is broken, everyone will just say, why don't I vote Reform then? But Robert Jenrick, I think, had actually the right idea for the Tories here, which is, well, no, we have to grovel for votes back and we have to show that we are changing. And how are you showing you are changing when you are effectively kicking the person out of the party who is effectively trying to grovel to the electorate? Because that is what he has done. I mean, I still don't trust the guy, don't get me wrong, but there's no doubt in my mind that he gets the problems with Britain. Anyway, she insisted that the Tory party was the best place to offer solutions to the country's problems, saying Reform were destined to fail as they welcome toxic people who destroy organisations. Not sure that is the best line to run on either, but it's what she's sticking to. A movement built on grievance and serial disloyalty is doomed to fail, and they will be at each other's throats soon enough, the opposition leader wrote. We'll see about that. There's a risk to that, certainly, but at the same time, basically the only thing stopping Reform going above 35% is the fact that people don't see them as building a team or having experience. I'm not being funny, but Danny Kruger, Robert Jenrick, even Andrew Rosindell, who we'll get into soon, plenty of people with experience. To be fair, Rosindell I don't think has been in the cabinet, but still, he is an experienced MP. Anyway, when Kemi Badenoch made it clear that Robert Jenrick had no place in the Tory party, she also said she is 100% confident there won't be more major defections to Reform, as she trades blows with Robert Jenrick over his lies. Anyway, mere hours after that headline, Conservative Shadow Foreign Minister defects to Reform, so it's quite clear that actually there were more defections almost instantly. It took basically a day. And this is a guy who is quite a large Thatcherite, so he's certainly on my side of the Reform Party, along with being a man who has openly been a Pinochet apologist, mainly because he was a better alternative than the communist regime that they had. I mean, that alone is quite a likeable characteristic of this guy. As I say, I couldn't see on Wikipedia he'd ever been in the cabinet, but obviously he's had a shadow cabinet role, and he's been an MP since 2001. So, as far as I'm concerned, a pretty decent guy. Anyway, the Times were publishing article after article from both Reform and Tories, effectively giving their take on this whole thing. Robert Jenrick's was quite interesting. Britain is broken and only a revolution can fix it, which is quite different to what Danny Kruger has been saying. Obviously, he's been leaning more onto the reformist side. Robert Jenrick's obviously here more on the revolution side. I can take either. As far as I'm concerned, it's just semantics. If you basically want to root and branch, completely change the civil service and actually make ministers responsible for their own departments, then as far as I'm concerned, we're in good graces. The post-1997 political economy has failed, and unlike my old Tory colleagues, Reform is willing to admit this and find new answers. Anyway, I'd say the highlight of this article is Jenrick pointing out all the poor missteps that the Tory party have made. For instance, he says, from 1970 to 2007, real wages rose by a third every 10 years, and since then they've flatlined. By 2031, we're on track to be poorer than Poland. Today's 18 to 30-year-olds are the first Britons to earn less than their parents, and trust me, it's very, very irritating. Meanwhile, the tax burden has risen to its highest level since the 50s, and public services, they've got worse. 93% of crimes go unsolved, our army is the smallest it's been for 200 years, the courts are backlogged, prisons are overflowing, 1 in 5 kids are persistently absent from school. In 2012, 1 in 20 people who went to A&E waited more than 4 hours, now it's 8 times that. Everybody I know, myself included, has seen firsthand that the NHS just isn't working. I have to say my experience is actually mixed with A&E departments. I was in and out with a sprained ankle in about an hour, couple of years ago now, but then going to Wales, I ended up going into A&E for my girlfriend at about 8 o'clock at night, and we just left at 4 in the morning because we're not waiting anymore and I had work to do, and it's awful. It is awful. Small boats have brought 193,000 since 2018, that's just the ones we know. Last year, one of them raped a 12-year-old girl in Nuneaton. Others have been terrorists, and another raped a girl in Hale. which is where Cheshire Housewives is filmed, for goodness sake. I'm not joking, I should do a video on this, but I watched Cheshire Housewives when it first came out simply because I knew the area, and honestly, the hotel where the migrants are staying, probably about 50 metres away from some of the restaurants that the Cheshire Housewives film in. It's crazy to think about. But the interesting part is here. The Tory party take a different view. At a recent Cabinet away day, we were told plainly that the Conservatives don't believe Britain is broken. The starkness of this message caught me off guard, and I argued back that I thought it was. A majority of people in the room disagreed. As Kemi herself wrote last week, she does not believe the country is broken, neither does her shadow cabinet. To mean that whether or not we can admit that Britain is broken matters. Hence, he obviously made the decision to join Reform from there, which to some extent I can respect. Obviously, it's still at the forefront of my mind. Hold on a minute. Nuneaton, Jenrick waiver. As I say, and as I said in my video on Friday, you have been given one opportunity to redeem yourself. Do not screw it up, because ultimately I can see how you would be quite useful in the Reform Party, but I also see plenty of reasons to not have allowed you in. However, the decision has been made. I know Zia Yusuf's not particularly happy about it, and neither am I, but ultimately we can have a compromise of, okay, we are not having any more Tory defectors after May the 7th, because now it really does look like they're jumping ship to save their bacon. Whereas Jenrick, as I say, I think he's actually had a true principled conversion. I just don't think he should be trusted. Anyway, as I say, Reform advisor James Orr has also written for The Times saying Robert Jenrick is only following the logic of the new right. Behind all the intrigue, his Tory reform switch reflects the belief that cosmopolitan politics is in terminal decline. It's not just in terminal decline, but people hate it. I hate it. I want it completely gone. It has done nothing good for the country. You can't have a completely stagnant country, both culturally and economically, for 30 years and expect people to be happy with it, and expect people to have a shred of mercy for the people that caused this. But just like Robert Jenrick, James Orr seems to almost have a disgust for the very political system that, well, he's been surrounded in, I suppose. I suppose James Orr hasn't been quite as bad as Jenrick in that regard, but anyway. For decades, Britain's ruling class has governed the country as if it were nowhere in particular, treating it as a zone to manage rather than a home to cherish and defend. Against this, Reform is beginning to articulate what is routinely dismissed and demonised as right-wing populism, but which is much better understood as a vision animated by the politics of home. To establishment critics on both the left and right, Reform represents an existential threat to progressive achievements. And they're not even thinking of getting rid of gay marriage. To increasingly many millions of voters, however, it represents recognition of a simple truth. Human beings are always and everywhere rooted beings whose love and loyalties radiate onwards from the particular and not the universal. When Farage burst back into the political scene in 2024, he decided immediately that Reform's principal slogan would be family, community, country. Those three words mark a major ideological shift from the Thatcherite free market language that has defined his earlier career. I really do get annoyed when people call it Thatcherite free market, but there's no getting away from it, so I may as well just call it Powellism from now on. Farage sensed that neither Thatcherite neoliberalism nor Labour statism could address the growing sense of cultural erosion and economic decline millions were experiencing, and that's what a lot of people have joined the Reform Party for. And listen, Thatcherism was specifically a reaction to socialism that we had in Britain from the war, and realistically we're not in the same situation here. We have rather a neo-Keynesianism MMT style that the Greens like to pretend that we don't currently live in. Reform understand that you can't just keep borrowing till your credit rating goes to the lowest it can possibly go, and you can't possibly pay any of it back, so you have to default. But at the same time, they realise that a completely unhinged free market, as much as Ancapistan would be beautiful, it's not going to make the losers particularly happy. So there does have to be a lovely middle ground that I hope they will find. And it's one that they are certainly only offering to British citizens, which I know, well, citizenship's been handed out like candy. I know. I would hope that they have a policy on that eventually. but it's quite clear that not letting people on ILR get benefits is a very good first step, because honestly, just giving benefits and social housing to people who shouldn't have it, who don't even have British citizenship, is going to do wonders, and I mean wonders, for the public spending issue. And the article's basically saying this is all a good thing, as you can tell, and it's good that Robert Jenrick has finally realised that it's the home for this sort of thing. I mean, realistically, what is Tory policy? What was their big announcement? Stamp duty's going. Okay, it is a good policy, but it's not something that's going to, ultimately make people go, God, I really want to vote for that, because ultimately people have much more immediate issues. Anyway, with all that Tory psychodrama, and obviously Tory MPs are going to be looking at reform as quite the decent alternative, whether in principle or just to save their job, Farage does have to make it constantly clear that Reform UK will not become the Conservative Party 2.0 after the defection of Robert Jenrick. Nigel Farage wrote in The Telegraph that Reform was not a rescue charity for every panicky Tory MP, and any potential defector would have to be prepared to admit publicly that the previous Tory government broke the country. And that's, it's not a perfect baseline, but it's a pretty good baseline, and it's one thing that I have noticed. They seem to have been told two things. One, you are going to break up the relationship between you and, say, the Tory graph. Great example, Robert Jenrick basically saying to Camilla Tominley, why are you asking a completely stupid question? I'm not going to tell you when I'm defecting, and I don't have to answer all your questions. And then obviously she posts the private conversation on WhatsApp to Twitter, which I don't really know what she expected from that, but there we go. But anyway, the second thing, of course, is you have to denigrate and burn your bridge back to the Tory party, because we have to have a level of trust here. And obviously you can just say, oh, this is politics, they were just saying that thing, and that is actually made more true by the fact that there has been a lot of sniping between Jenrick and Farage and Zia. However, it is quite clear from what Kemi Badenoch has said, the bridge is well and truly burned, and I think it'll only be if the Tories are in existential crisis that they would build the bridge again. The problem you have there is that why would anyone join a party currently suffering an existential crisis? You can say that, but I joined the Tories when Sunak became the Prime Minister because I wanted to join and make my voice heard within the party, because I thought they'd last for quite a while. I didn't think that Reform were going to make a comeback back in 2022, 2023, whenever it was. But now this has happened, well, I found a new home. And you know what's keeping me there? It's the fact that, and I know a lot of you watch my channel, it's the fact that online I'm getting a lot of positive vibes from the people in the party, and even people in real life. I'm also planning to go to the conference this year. I'm going to try and get that at the forefront of my mind, so if you want to meet me, well, I'll be there. Can't wait for September. But anyway, last thing I will say on this topic of Tory Party 2.0 is that we are supposedly getting a Labour ex-MP on Tuesday, so look forward to who that is. Basically, everyone's money's on Katie Hoey, and mine is too, so there we go. Anyway, we may as well touch on how the Labour Party are doing with all this news. Well, when asked about all this, Lisa Nandy was on Lauren Kusenberg, and she said Farage would lead fascist government. Culture Secretary says Reform UK leader has tried to scapegoat ethnic minorities in absence of policies. I'm not being funny, they've not talked about immigration for about 3 months. And that does kind of make sense, by the way, because ultimately, what the main focus is coming into May, Scotland and Wales. As much as they are affected by immigration, it's not top priority compared to England. But there's a lot of immigration that happens within England, especially in the major cities there. But when it comes to Scotland and Wales, it's mostly just Cardiff, Glasgow and Edinburgh, which is not where you're going to get most of your power. Hence, they're focusing on farmers and things like that. Certainly in Wales, anyway. But yeah, this is a ridiculous thing to say. So Farage will be a fascist prime minister. He scapegoats people with different coloured skin, aside from Zia Youssef and Lila Cunningham, I guess. In an interview with Sky News, so it wasn't Laura Kusenberg, Ms Nandy refused to be drawn on reports that she had warned cabinet colleagues that there was a prospect of a fascist government led by Mr Farage. Honestly, it's crazy what these people say. She heavily suggested she would use that term, adding, I've got a lot of experience of living with the consequences of othering and people who are trying to divide us from one another. As if I don't, I work for a living, you've divided me from my own money. And I guess I would just say that if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, in my experience, it's usually a duck. Mr. Farage's party had a large lead in the polls, has previously been likened to Adolf Hitler by figures on the hard left, including Sultana, the Your Party co-founder, and John McDonnell, the Labour MP. So now you look like a quack, Ms. Nandy. But attacks like this are going to ramp up because not attacking them based on being racist and Hitler or whatever hasn't worked, so now they're trying to do that despite the fact they tried it at the conference season and it didn't work. They don't understand why none of their attacks are working, and it's basically because they can't actually sort out the cost of living crisis or immigration because they're so ideologically captured that actually socialism is good, the soft socialism they like anyway, and immigration is actually very good and needs to basically continue. Because you've got to bear in mind that the Boris wave has given them a great out to say, oh look, we managed to get 800,000 less immigrants over the 3 years we were in power. Oh, how'd you manage that? Oh, well, we're using the peak of the Boris wave numbers. When actually you're just back at the level of immigration that literally caused such a fiery Brexit debate on immigration. So you're not going to win in that case, are you? Anyway, naturally this fight was taken to Twitter, where there's a bit more direct back and forth. The Tories came out with a video saying it's time for the truth, where effectively it's a load of clips of Farage and Robert Jenrick having pretty hard-hitting things to say to each other. They're just not serious. Robert Jenrick brought over a load of Afghans. Robert Jenrick saying Farage just isn't serious. How can you trust him? Things like that. You know, it's great when people make up, is what I say. But Kemi Badenoch said Nigel Farage is happy to take someone he thinks is a fraud into his party as long as it harms the Tories. I'm sure this will end well. He's fighting to destroy the Tory party. We are fixing to fix the country. You're trying to fix the country? Oh, interesting. Is that because the country's broken, Ms. Badenoch? Again, you kicked a man out over basic semantics that effectively you're following anyway. What was the point of all this? Anyway, 2 days later, after saying that she would be fixing Britain, she had to say, Britain isn't broken, but politics is. Yeah, that's what people mean by Britain is broken. Again, really weird semantics. And again, if you're admitting politics is broken, you know, oh, we can't say Britain is broken, we have to address our record then. If we say politics is broken, that's better. How? That's still 14 years of your fault. Too many politicians are in it for themselves, not the country. Grievance fixes nothing. Hard work and serious leadership do. Only Tories have a plan to get Britain working. I was going to go through the clip, but if that's a summary, that's a summary. I'm really not interested at this point. Again, I think the Tory party is going to collapse by next election, and they will be a regional party, as Nigel Farage keeps saying. Effectively, they will be snipping over the Lib Dems with certain seats in rural areas of England, and that's pretty much it. Now we move on to ex-Tory MP Matthew Parris, who was in Parliament till 86. And since then has mostly been a Tory activist, but voted Lib Dem from 2019 onward because of Brexit, so that really goes to show you what side of the fence he's on. But he said Kemi Badenoch must seize One Nation opportunity. Shedding rebel to reform gives Conservative leader a chance to fill in a gaping hole at the centre of British politics. Says man who's been voting Lib Dem for 7 years. I mean, that just goes to show you how useless the Lib Dems are. But ultimately, if this doesn't prove people like Farage, Zia, even Rupert Lowe-Wright, that the Tory party is just filled to the brim with people who may as well be Lib Dems, I don't know what will. What's the point of an alternative Lib Dem party? Basically nothing, aside from the fact that it's going to split that Middle England vote and hopefully give Reform a chance, but we'll see about that. So he says this: uncharacteristically, Farage is making a mistake, trying to give his party coherence and weight. But populism is weightless and incoherent, or it is nothing. Which is such a... If you want to see what political snobbery looks like, just read something like that. Populism is incoherent and weightless. What is incoherent and weightless about less immigration would lead to less cultural sensitivities, I suppose you could say, or tensions is probably a better word. You agree basically with all the economic stuff, which is that taxes are too high, public spending's way too high, and hopefully you don't think immigrants should be getting on benefits. So I don't know what your problem is there. Ultimately, this is once again just an argument for the adults are back in the room. Well, sorry, you had your One Nation in charge from 2014 to 2019. Everyone, well, not everyone hated it because they kept getting re-elected, but it was a better alternative than Corbyn and Miliband, which isn't really saying much. I did think Farage knew that, but which of us can remember our limitations when cameras come calling? Sorry, but but you can be a populist with plenty of coherent policy. That is what most of European right is heading towards. Now, you probably could make this claim with MAGA, especially with the stupid stuff they're doing with Greenland at the moment, but ultimately, they have managed to basically sort immigration. But economically, yeah, they're all over the place. This gives Kemi Badenoch wings. Hopefully a few more right-wing malcontents will quit the Tories to join Reform. Again, there's that political snobbery. Opposition whips will have a little list, but instead of trying to keep their grumbles grumbling within the Tory fold, whips should gently suggest that they might be in the wrong party. Okay, so you end up losing, I don't know, let's say 30 MPs. You know, you risk actually losing your position as official opposition. If 30 or so Tories defect to Reform and not the Lib Dems end up as official opposition. And when that happens, you open the door to a load of wet Tories going to the Lib Dems. Please keep going with this push. In fact, keep pushing people out of the Tory party in Parliament, please. It might be a mistake long term for Reform to take on too many Tories, but realistically, this hubris could kill the Tory party, and Matthew Parris doesn't realise it, basically because he's surrounded by people they're basically in an echo chamber. That's what the political and political journalist class are, and that's why, as we'll go into at the end, Zia Youssef absolutely hate them. Badenoch had long waited to be rid of Jenrick, and lo, he gave her the perfect excuse to give him a push. Hopefully more barnacles will choose to leave the Tory boat. This liberates Badenoch, freeing her to cease looking anxiously over her right shoulder. They're gone, hallelujah. Sorry, but Danny Kruger leaving, I have heard, has been referred to as 9/11 for the Tory party. Robert Jenrick is, well, honestly, it's probably worse. He was what the right wing of the Tory party were orbiting around. I'm not being funny, but this is part of the reason I was worried and criticising him so heavily, because ultimately that is a threat to Reform. Well, now he's part of Reform, so he's going to bring an awful lot of that orbit with him. Hell, we already had Andrew Rosindell move over. Could we see people like Katie Lamb, Esther McVeigh and others join? Maybe. They've only got a couple of months, so they better get moving. But ultimately, this is what the wets of the Tory party are thinking. Thank God we don't have to deal with that snotty populism anymore. That's all in the Reform party now. Why do you think Reform have been beating you for so long? It's because they are representing that populism that a lot of the country want. If you think that this is going to damage them in the polls, I've got news for you. As it turns out, and I'm somewhat surprised by this, pretty much universally it's seen as a good idea by the Reform activists. I'm basically in the minority of I don't think that this was a good long-term move. I'm in the minority, so you're definitely not losing activists over this. In fact, I went leafleting at the weekend, as I said, and yeah, just as many came, and literally none of them had a bad thing to say about Jenrick. And in fact, we're saying, more Tories would be good, actually. Suella Braverman, I think, says an awful lot of things that are good, and tried to cause a lot of chaos in the Home Office, I suppose. But again, she's probably worse than Jenrick, I'd say. But again, with what the activists have been saying and the conversations I've had, it's probably actually a good idea, because ultimately I want the Tories completely gone. Anyway, while the One Nations are celebrating this fact, people who are actually suffering from the One Nations winning for years actually have a bit of a different tune. A Conservative member of the Senedd has criticised UK party leader Kemi Badenoch and said the party needs to change. James Evans refused to engage with the question of whether he was going to follow his very strongly principled friend Robert Jenrick and defect to Reform UK. We're very forgiving of Reform UK, do stay open to it. Jenrick told the BBC's Lauren Kusenberg that a meeting of the Shadow Cabinet to where they failed to agree with him that Britain was broken had been the last straw for him. And obviously, Badenoch said Britain isn't broken. Well, Evans said, we have to take some level of responsibility for the mess the country's in. Kemi should reflect on that comment, because I don't think that comment is going to be made by the being made by the majority of people who support the Tory party across the country. And this is the problem that the Tory party have. They still have a massive political fault line, and ultimately what this Jenrick kicking out event has done is made it quite clear that where the line is certainly leaning toward the One Nations. And ultimately, they are the ones everyone is fed up with. They are effectively the Lib Dems. So, unfortunately, I think this is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back for the Tory party, and I think over the next couple of years they're going to shrink and decline until, I don't know, maybe they get 20 seats or so. Yeah, they're doing slightly better with the Badenoch bounce and everything like that, and even Reform activists have been saying she's good at the dispatch box. But we're all political junkies. Normies still don't really know who she is. In fact, I think this inherent contradiction between this fault line of Britain isn't actually broken, we need to fix it, and Britain is completely broken, it's our fault and we need to fix it, is shown by the two headlines from the Daily Telegraph and Express. Badenoch, Britain is not broken. Daily Express, we will fix broken Britain but not together. Kemi and Jenrick split. Which is it? Well, quite clearly it's Jenrick saying we'll fix broken Britain but not together, and Kemi Badenoch saying, oh, Britain is not broken but it needs to be fixed. One is more inherently contradictory than the other. In fact, one's not contradictory at all, and I happen to be on the side that is not with the contradictor. So expect even more insane coping from the Tory side of things. Anyway, people more on the, say, 2019 Boris Johnson side, before he went bad, I want to make that very, very clear. People such as Miriam Cates are clearly on the Robert Jenrick side of the fault line. So Carrie Cole reports, for Badenoch it's time, now the nutters have gone, for an olive branch toward men like Kenneth Clarke, Michael Heseltine, David Gork and Dominic Grieve, and that's from the Matthew Paris article, and Miriam Cates, as I say, still a Tory, saying Ed Davey should be worried. In other words, even people who are ostensibly still Tories are very critical about this and basically saying, maybe the accusation that the Tories are just going to be blue Lib Dems is true. And I'm not being funny, but I caught a bit of GB News with Miriam Cates hosting as they were talking about Robert Jenrick, and she didn't look happy. It has to be said, she did not look happy. Because ultimately, this is, well, a social group moving over to a side that she's been somewhat critical of, and knows that she is eventually going to have to make the move herself. And she's one that I am more than welcoming. She's a bit moronic and too online safety act sided of things, but, well, again, if you officially move over in an advisory capacity, yes, you have to basically denigrate all that nonsense because it is horrendously stupid. I mean, hell, if Nadine Dorries is happy to do it and it's her baby, I think anyone could pretty much do it. Anyway, I think that covers the internal drama of the Tory party. External drama of the Tory party. Liz Truss said, Robert Jenrick may have joined Reform, but who is he getting his orders from? Trojan horse. What everyone's basically landed on here is, Liz Truss, what the hell are you talking about? Also, can you stop Connor Tomlinson from being your advisor if you're going to say stupid stuff like this? Clearly that it is a Tomlinsonism. And, well, it's pretty obvious that she has tried to join Reform and been rejected, for the obvious reason that she is nothing but Brad Press and a liability. Anyway, political commentator, author and pollster James Frayne had this to say, ignore the Tory talking points, Jenrick's defection is Kemi's biggest blunder yet. And honestly, she didn't actually have a choice. Farage stands to benefit from having a talented politician with cabinet experience, and beyond that, the core of the Tory right. So it's hard to know which Tory claim of the last week is more ridiculous, the one suggesting Badenoch handled Jenrick's defection to Reform well, which I always found an odd one, or the one suggesting the Tories are better off without him. We've heard both absurdities in the last week, when in reality Farage is being handed yet another nail to hammer into the Tory coffin. So the first claim that Badenoch did a great job firing him, it's true that taking fast and decisive action with rapid briefing of her own team was a technical success, but too many people are missing a more fundamental point. Jenrick partly left because she consistently treated him badly after her leadership win. Jenrick ran a decent, energetic leadership campaign and had extensive experience in government, not least as cabinet minister. Even though Tory ranks were hugely depleted after the 2024 elections, he gave him a junior cabinet position role, the Shadow Justice Secretary, that was clearly beneath him. Further, even as he became Shadow Cabinet's highest profile and most effective performer, she left him in this junior role. A whole bunch of non-entities, therefore, sat in more senior positions, dominating the highest stakes parliamentary occasions, while doing nothing to improve the party's position in the poll. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, and that has been said on, I've heard it on the Telegraph, and certainly their podcast quite a bit. Jenrick was simply put in a role that basically was half, oh, here's a reward for being part of the Tory party, but also you're not becoming Shadow Chancellor, because that would be too high profile and you would outdo me at every turn. And again, you can partly blame this on Jenrick for trying his best to constantly outshine Kemi Badenoch, which he was clearly trying to do. And obviously we might have that problem in Reform now. Anyway, the next claim, Tories are better off without him. This was just extraordinary. Jenrick was one of the few politicians who was really taking the battle to Labour. In a role that only lends itself occasionally to high-profile campaigning, for example, over the early release of Prisoners, Jenrick put a series of issues on the map you wouldn't expect to hear much about. He also did the fare-dodging thing and the graffiti in the London Underground. I mean, as much as there are other communicators who are probably as good as him in reform, I don't know, Zia Yusuf, he was one of the more talented ones of the Tory party, if not the most talented. Certainly better than Katie Lamb, who the Tory right have largely been pushing quite recently, but honestly I wouldn't be shocked if she's thinking of defecting too. It's not as easy for her, given that she is, one of the new intakes. More broadly, his media performance and speeches were assured and cleared. While many politicians barely improve over their careers, Jenrick measurably stepped up his performance over time. Very simply, he was a much better performer than Badenoch. Certainly agree with that sentence, and he leaves a massive hole in the shadow cabinet. It will be interesting to see how the Tory comms are from now on, to be fair, because Badenoch's just not very good at it. She's good in the dispatch box, but that's one, a very easy target on Labour, and two, very, very, very scripted, which I suppose a lot of the social media ones are, but ultimately that then comes to a downfall in media interviews that are live. Anyway, the last few paragraphs of this I find the most interesting. It's been suggested Farage falls out with people who challenge him, and he doesn't like having people of similar status around him. Indeed, this is raised as a further worry about what a Farage-led government would look like, but hiring Jenrick as well as Nadhim Zahawi, Farage has blown up that suggestion. It would appear that Reform's leader has indeed started to prepare for governance in earnest, and if anything, this whole saga raises the question as to whether it is in fact Badenoch who doesn't like the challenge of having top people around. She treated Jenrick poorly, and while she has finally promoted Nick Timothy, after his superb work at exposing West Midlands policing mishap of Mackie Tel Aviv game, Katie Lamb still sits in relative obscurity in a junior role. There are other politicians of status and quality who linger on the back benches. Across Westminster, people are desperately talking up Badenoch, and this simply isn't reflected in the polls on voting intention, and the party is heading towards oblivion. This is a pollster saying this despite Tories having a bit of a recovery in the polls. I just want to point that out. That's very funny. In a month when the public memories of the chaos of Jenrick's departure totally fade, the reality will be this. Their party's recent top performer will be attacking them for their failures in government and their lack of imagination in opposition. Ugh. This is a disaster for Badenoch and an incredible boost for Nigel Farage. Again, short term, I can see the plus of Jenrick. It's the long term I worry about. Anyway, on the point of political snobbery, we will end here. One of the people in this photograph, I can't remember which one it is, but the people in this photograph are obviously Jeremy Hunt on the left, two political journalists in the middle, Laura Kusenberg and Kay Burley of Sky News, and then there's Tracy Brabin, who is Labour Mayor of West Yorkshire. And they're here saying, "Where are you, Nigel Farage? We were looking forward to it." Now, apparently Nigel Farage was feeling too under the weather to make this media appearance, but obviously the implication here is that, Nigel Farage is too scared to join us, which is obvious nonsense. He goes into the lion's den pretty much daily. Zia Yusuf said, "As someone who entered politics 18 months ago, I've been shocked at just how pally and cosy politicians from legacy parties are with each other in green rooms, and it's very telling. And in fact, I think the biggest giveaway has to be How to Win an Election, run on Times Radio, hosted by Hugo Rifkin. But he has Danny Finkelstein, Tory Lord, a Labour Dame, and I think a Lib Dem political strategist. And pretty much every week, obviously, the issue of reform comes up, and they are just so single-minded on that reform is the enemy. It's kind of no wonder that basically the entrenched political class does see them as the enemy, because ultimately what is the point of reform? To flip the table on this whole, entrenched and untenable situation and position that they find themselves in. They laugh at how ill-informed they think voters are, catch up like old friends, and then go on panels and pretend to oppose each other. Pretty much. It's why nothing changes whether people vote Tory or Labour. They're globalists, open borders, Britain-hating traitors. I can certainly see that with Jeremy Hunt. To be honest, in this picture, Laura Kusenberg is one of the better ones, I will say. So I think it's a bit harsh on her, but as for the rest of them, yeah, pretty apt. Which is why they post stuff like this from the BBC, who of course are in the same boat. I find it sickening. They're the establishment. They must be cleared out, and soon they will be. Thank you, Zia, very cool. Well, ex-Tory MP Simon Clarke said, being able to converse politely with people with whom you profoundly disagree is simply about being a decent human being. As someone who has been in a green room with Zia, watching him sit ostentatiously apart is a matter for him. To me, it's both unnecessary and rather rude. The thing is that, this entrenched political class, as we just saw with Lisa Nandy, they are more than happy to call Nigel Farage, Zia Yousaf, Reform as a whole, racists. They've not gone as far as Hillary Clinton and called us a basket of deplorables, but they have basically done all but that at this point. It's clear that wanting basically net zero immigration or even net emigration is racist. It's clear that making changes to indefinite leave to remain, that's also racist, despite the fact that non-whites can become British via citizenship. Okay, we've obviously been giving out an awful lot more than we should have been. Again, that's a conversation that I'm sure we're going to be having in the near future. And so when you're expecting people like Zia Yousaf, myself, Nigel Farage, whoever, to engage cordially, well, you're asking a bit much if you're also part of a establishment that's all basically coming out to say, yeah, you know what, Robert Jenrick was racist and a liability, I'm glad to have him gone, despite the fact that he was clearly one of the better Tory MPs who was doing everything he could to save them from oblivion. But this is what happens when you're entrenched in tribal politics. It's completely expected, but ultimately it's a bit ridiculous to be fully entrenched in this political establishment that has basically called you racist for nigh on 30 years, and then for some reason they expect you to be cordial. Again, what's the other thing they've been saying? Oh, he's anti-Semitic because of things that a hearsay that happened when he was 12 to 17 in school. It's absolutely mad. Well, Zia clapped back at this, saying, thank you for corroborating my post, and no, I will never pretend to be friends with traitors like you, which again, a lot of established media types, political types, took this quite offensively. And ultimately, people who absolutely hate the political establishment as it exists, i.e. me, actually quite like the fact that we're represented by someone who clearly hates them, well, as much as people like me. Whenever Zia is on any sort of panel or anything like that, he lets his distaste for these people be known. The best example is when he was at the Spectator Awards.
And Reform is routinely polling at north of 30%. We've got 265,000 members. And I think I speak on behalf of Nigel, who's here tonight, and everyone else at Reform, when I say, and we genuinely and sincerely mean this, we could not have done it without you. Your ability, I've got to give credit where it's due. Your ability to vaporize your public support in such a short period of time is something to behold. So I encourage you all, please enjoy the delicious food, enjoy the beautiful wine, this incredible venue, and the hospitality of our friends at the Spectator, because soon enough you'll all lose your seat and you will not be invited again. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good luck.
He got basically no claps for that from the political establishment, because again, he clearly hates them. And again, a lot of the general public hates these people too, because ultimately we feel like we are in a complete rut, and there is only one person to blame. It's the political establishment. If people want to be successful, they had to get lucky and get into property early enough, or they had to move out of the goddamn country. That has obviously annoyed people that want Britain to succeed, like me, and like Zia Yousaf. So yes, while he may be crass, he's also very representative of people like me, and that's pretty close to 30% of the country if polls are to be believed. So as I say, I am looking forward to Reform hitting 40% in the polls this year, because I don't see how, we're in five-party politics now. The only one that's really differentiated themselves is Reform. The Greens kind of differentiate themselves by being openly communist, but ultimately, Lib Dems, Labour, Tories, they're all basically after the same thing, and that is the failed yesteryear of establishment politics. And this is why, as it turns out, Robert Jenrick moving over is probably in the long term a good move too. We'll have to wait and see on that. I still don't trust him, so keep your eyes peeled, gentlemen. But with that, I will leave the video there, so please do subscribe, leave a like, leave a comment, do also become a channel member, or leave super chats and super thanks as you see fit. As for shilling, obviously videos out as and when I can make them. Wednesday we have more dispatch for the gaming stream. On Thursday, sorry, we record Thursday, but on Friday we do release the Wolves of Westminster Down the Pub podcast. And I believe on Friday as well, I should be on that Crime Guys quiz night. So do look forward to that. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching. And until next time, goodbye.